In this final portion of the lecture, we'll look about what, if anything, we can determine about Satoshi Nakamoto himself, and also the ideas that he had in the design of Bitcoin by looking at the history of the ideas that led up to the invention of Bitcoin. So first off, just as a refresher, who is Satoshi Nakamoto? A lot of people know him as the creator of Bitcoin, and that's sort of an abstract notion. Okay, we can be a little more specific about what was done in the name of Satoshi Nakamoto. So according to Satoshi Nakamoto, and I'll note as an aside that when Satoshi asserts that something is true, I'm going to take him at his word. Okay, I don't think just because he's anonymous, there's a reason that he's going to lie about certain things. So if he says that I started coding Bitcoin in May 2007, let's believe him and believe that that's true. So at least according to him, around May 2007 is when he started coding Bitcoin. He registered the domain bitcoin.org in August 2008. And at that time, he started sending private emails to a few people who were, he thought might be interested in the proposal. Okay? Then a little later, in October 2008, he released publicly a white paper that described the protocol, and then soon after he released the code for it as well. Then he stuck around for about 2 years. And over these ensuing 2 years, he posted lots of messages on message forums. He emailed with lots of people. He responded to people's concerns. On the code side, he submitted patches to the code. He fixed it up in conjunction with other developers and basically maintained the source code. In December 2010, he then left the project. Now, I'm referring to Satoshi Nakamoto as a he. I have no reason to believe that he's a he as opposed to a she. It's just since he assumed a male name, it's the easiest pronoun to use. Another thing I'm doing is I'm referring to him as a single individual. There is a theory that maybe Satoshi Nakamoto is a collection of individuals. I don't buy this theory. I think that he is probably an individual. The reason why is if we think about what was done in the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, if we start at the end and we think about the 2 years somebody spent replying to emails and patching code, it would be really hard to think that this would be multiple people sharing user accounts and passwords and responding in similar style, a similar voice, and making sure they didn't contradict each other. It just seems a much simpler explanation that at least this portion of what Satoshi did was done by a single individual. Now, if you look at what he writes and what he says and the patches that he makes to the code, it's clear that he understood, whoever this single individual is, that individual did understand the full code base of Bitcoin. And so it's very reasonable that they're also the person that created the original piece of Bitcoin software. Okay? It's also clear from their writings that they understood all the design aspects of Bitcoin, and so they're probably the person who wrote the white paper as well. There's no reason to assume otherwise. Now, all of this isn't to say that Satoshi didn't have help with the original design. However, we know that Satoshi is very quick to attribute any help he receives after Bitcoin is released to the people that contributed to the project. And there's no reason to think that he would lie about inventing something by himself when he actually had help from other individuals. Now, we might ask ourselves, what did Satoshi know about the history of eCash? And to understand this better, we can look at what he cites in his white paper and also the references that existed on early versions of the Bitcoin website. So if we look at his white paper, we see that he cites some papers on basic cryptography and probability theory. He also cites the timestamping work that we saw in the previous slides. And it's very natural to think that he based the design of the blockchain on these references since the similarities are so apparent. He also cites the Hashcash proposal, which has a proof of work that's very similar to the one that's used in Bitcoin. And he has a reference to B-money. Later on the website, he added references to BitGold and as well to Hal Finney's reusable proof of work schemes. Now, if we look at the history of email transactions that were made public by people who corresponded with Satoshi Nakamoto in the early days, we see that the B-money proposal was actually added after the fact at the suggestion of Adam Back. Satoshi then emailed Wei Dai, who created B-money, and apparently Wei Dai was the one that told him about Nick's proposal about BitGold. Okay, so these proposals weren't probably inspirations for the original design. He later corresponded a lot with Hal Finney, and that's quite a reasonable explanation for why he cites reusable proof of works, at least on the website. So based on just the citations in the white paper, it seems reasonable that maybe the only things that he knew or thought were relevant about the history of eCash was Hashcash and the timestamping proposals. In the early days of Bitcoin, Bitcoin had a Wikipedia article, and at some point it was flagged for deletion by the moderators of Wikipedia because they thought it wasn't relevant or noteworthy. And so there was some discussion between Satoshi and others about how to get this article so Wikipedia would accept it. And what Satoshi did is he actually suggested a stub article, a single sentence that describes Bitcoin. And the way he phrased it was the following: Bitcoin is an implementation of Wei Dai's B-Money, proposed on cypherpunks in 1998, and Nick Szabo BitGold proposal. So Satoshi at this point did see positioning Bitcoin as an extension of these two ideas, or an implementation of these two prior systems, as a good explanation of how it worked. However, from the previous slide, it seems that Satoshi actually didn't know about these two systems when he came up with the original design of Bitcoin. Now, what about everything else? The Chaumian eCash, all the credit card proposals that we looked at, all the microtransactions. What about all of that stuff? Did he know any of that history? Well, the answer is we don't know what he did know or what he didn't know, but he didn't give any indication really of knowing that history. And it's just as likely that he didn't reference this because it just wasn't relevant to Bitcoin. Bitcoin used a completely different model, and so there's no reason to talk about these old systems that failed. He does mention in passing Chaumian eCash in one of his blog posts when he's talking about another proposal called opencoin.org, and he notes that they seem to be talking about the old Chaumian central mint stuff, but maybe because that was the only thing available. Maybe they would be interested in going in a new direction. A lot of people automatically dismiss e-currency as a lost cause because of all the companies that failed since the 1990s. I hope it's obvious it was only the centrally controlled nature of those systems that doomed them. I think this is the first time we're trying to decentralize non-trust-based system. So this gives a really nice idea, or a nice view of what Satoshi thought of the earlier proposals, and specifically how he felt Bitcoin was different, which is that Bitcoin moved in a decentralized manner. And from our study of all the previous systems, we can see that this is true, that this is a defining feature of Bitcoin that's not present in a lot of the systems that we looked at. Another interesting quote from Satoshi suggests that maybe he's not an academic. A lot of academics think about ideas and write them down immediately. Satoshi says that he took an opposite approach. He says, I actually did Bitcoin kind of backwards. I had to write all the code before I could convince myself that I could solve every problem. Then I wrote the paper. I think I will be able to release the code sooner than I could write a detailed specification. A final question we may ask ourselves, colored by what we understand from the history of eCash, is why does Satoshi maintain his anonymity? The first reason might be it's just for fun. There's lots of people that write novels that are anonymous. There's graffiti artists like Banksy that maintain their anonymity. And at that time, in the community that he was involved in, the cypherpunk community and the cryptography mailing list, there were lots of people that were posting on that mailing list in an anonymous fashion. The second, that ties a little closer to what we've seen, is maybe there were legal reasons that he was concerned about revealing his identity. There were a couple of events in particular that led up to the release of Bitcoin where two other proposals, one was called Liberty Reserve and the other eGold, which we talked briefly about, ran into legal trouble for money laundering. In particular, in 2006, the CEO or the founders of Liberty Reserve actually fled the United States because they were afraid they were going to be indicted on money laundering charges. And for eGold, the founders stayed in the United States and they were actually indicted and eventually pled guilty to the charges. And this guilty plea was registered just right before Satoshi started the Bitcoin and website and started emailing people about his proposal. That said, there's lots of people that invented eCash systems and nobody else was scared of the legal implications and no one else remained anonymous as well. So this may have been a reason, it may not have been the reason. Another thing is that we mentioned that certain aspects of eCash were patented. And if you go back to the culture of the cypherpunk movement, they were concerned about implementing eCash systems because they may violate the patents of some of the technology that was patented. And so here's a post proposing that, for example, they launch a project to implement David Chaum's eCash system, which was subject to a patent. And they do it under the guise of anonymity so that no one knows who they are. And then if they get sued for violating the patent, no one can find them to actually issue the lawsuit. A final reason that's often cited is that because Bitcoin was so successful and Satoshi has a lot of Bitcoins that are worth a lot of money, that maybe he's doing this for personal security reasons. And this could very well be the reason why he maintains his anonymity. Choosing to be anonymous isn't a decision you make once, it's something that you continually make on a continuing basis. That said, it probably wasn't the original reason. At the original reasons, the first time Satoshi used the name Satoshi Nakamoto, he hadn't even released the white paper or the code base for Bitcoin, and it's hard to imagine that he had any idea that it would be as successful as it was. It's clear that he understood the potential of it, he understood that it could be successful, but he wasn't a perfect oracle of the future. He made mistakes just like everyone else, both in the code. He had some features that he added to Bitcoin, like sending money to IP addresses that never caught on. No one thought they were useful. When he described what Bitcoin was useful for, he gave a bunch of use cases that were very centered on the idea of using it across the internet, which of course is a huge use case for Bitcoin, but it's not the only one. He didn't really envision it being used by stores, going into a coffee and using Bitcoin to pay for your coffee, for example. But last but not least, he was generally adopted the tone of being optimistic about the future of Bitcoin, but also being cautious. He understood that previous companies had failed and that Bitcoin may fail as well. And so he supported a very conservative approach, especially in the early days when a lot of attention was perhaps going to be applied to Bitcoin should WikiLeaks choose to start accepting Bitcoins after credit card companies shut down people's ability to donate to that project. He warned the other developers that this could have bad consequences for the project, and the Bitcoin project might not succeed if they went ahead and got WikiLeaks to start accepting Bitcoin. WikiLeaks, by the way, did do that, and the Bitcoin project survived that. But that was right at the time that Satoshi left the project.